Some albums have a bad reputation. And then there are albums that are almost mythically bad. Records that critics tore apart on release. That fans prefer not to talk about. That even the band members themselves later distanced from. Today, we're looking at one of those albums. In this series, we always ask the same question. Is it really as bad as everyone says? Or are we dealing with a reputation that has grown larger than the music itself? With Metallica, it wasn't as bad as expected. With U2, there was more to discover than people remembered. And with Dylan, there was even hidden beauty to be found. But this time we're dealing with an album often cited as one of the biggest missteps in rock history. The final breath of a legendary band. A record that sounds like an internal war set to vinyl. Ladies and gentlemen, The Clash, Cut the Crap. Hello, and welcome to a brand new episode of We're Only in It for the Music, a YouTube series that takes you through the musical universe, from ABBA to Zappa and everything in between and beyond. Click the like and subscribe buttons, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss an episode. But enough of that, never mind the bollocks. We're only in it for the music. The question we ask and try to answer in this series is simple. Is it really that bad? Yes, absolutely.
Well, no, hold on a minute.
Wait, it's not going to be that simple today. Because while Cut the Crap has been considered the weakest Clash album for decades, and for some, even one of the worst albums ever made by a major band, the story behind this record is anything but simple. What exactly went wrong? Is there anything here worth saving? And more importantly, are we really just hearing failure? Or are there still traces of a band that once stood among the greatest of its generation? It's time to take another look and another listen. Oh boy, wish me luck. I'm gonna need it. The Clash are widely regarded as one of the most influential punk bands to emerge from the United Kingdom. Their impact on popular music is difficult to overstate. From their raw debut to the masterful London Calling, the band constantly reinvented themselves while maintaining urgency and conviction. If London Calling was already ambitious as a double album, Sandinista pushed even further, a triple LP that, according to Joe Strummer, was partly designed to frustrate the record label. Even Combat Rock in 1982 delivered major hits and several Clash classics. But after that, something began to shift. Tensions within the band escalated before work even began on a new album. Joe Strummer increasingly clashed with guitarist Mick Jones, whom he felt had embraced a rock and roll lifestyle that contradicted everything the Clash once stood for. At the same time, drummer Topper Headon was battling a severe heroin addiction. The result, both core members were gone. What remained was a stripped-down version of The Clash, with Strummer and bassist Paul Simonon as the only original members, and manager Bernie Rhodes regaining significant influence. New musicians were recruited through auditions. A new lineup was assembled. On paper, The Clash still existed. In reality, the foundation was deeply fractured. In the classic lineup, Mick Jones largely shaped the music while Strummer focused on lyrics. With Jones gone, a creative vacuum emerged. The remaining members reportedly believed that anyone could write a punk song. That assumption proved optimistic. Meanwhile, Bernie Rhodes' influence expanded, not just as manager, but as a creative force behind the new album, a role for which he had little practical experience. The reformed Clash briefly toured the American West Coast to test new material, while former drummer Topper Headon performed under the name The Real Clash. The chaos was no longer subtle. In response, Strummer wrote the tellingly titled We Are the Clash, almost a defensive statement of identity. After the tour, the band entered a Munich studio under Rhodes' direction. He was determined to radically reinvent the band's sound. His vision, a hybrid of electro, hip-hop, and experimental cut-up techniques. In his words, a new genre. Live musicians were replaced with programmed drums and synthetic layers. Tracks were packed with samples and additional overdubs. Even Paul Simonon's bass parts were ultimately removed and re-recorded by a session musician. Strummer and Rhodes frequently clashed during the sessions. Strummer wanted songs, Rhodes wanted a concept. Engineer Michael Fain later summarized the situation bluntly. Rhodes wanted to sever all connection to the past and assume complete control. By the time recording was finished, the internal cohesion of the band had eroded completely. What had once been a tight, ideologically driven group now felt like a project without a clear identity. And you can hear it. Synthesizers and drum machines dominate the sound. Guitars are layered so heavily that definition disappears. Where The Clash once delivered sharp, immediate urgency, this album sounds crowded and directionless. So, the question seems simple. We can conclude that Cut the Crap sounds problematic. But is that the whole story? What about the songs themselves? Is there anything buried beneath the production? Let's examine it, track by track. We open the album with Dictator, and within 10 seconds, you can already hear the problem. The drums sound extremely sterile, as if they weren't played, but assembled. On top of that sit hand claps so badly placed they border on parody. This is exactly the kind of production the 1980s became infamous for, but applied to a band that was never built for it. Because this isn't a synth pop band. This is The Clash. Or at least, what's left of them. And that's why it feels so wrong. You can hear that the band, or whatever remains of it, is trying to achieve something. There's intent here, urgency, but it's completely smothered by a production that suffocates everything. Synthesizers meant to sound like brass, but coming across as cheap. A marimba that appears out of nowhere. And an arrangement so crowded that the vocals almost drown. The lyrics are barely intelligible, not because Strummer is unclear, but because the music constantly gets in the way. It feels less like a song built around an idea, and more like a track built around a concept of what modern was supposed to sound like. And that concept wins, over the energy, over the message, over the band itself. A strong opener? No, but it does serve as a perfect summary of the core problem of this album. Dirty Punk initially feels like a small relief. The sound leans a bit more toward rock, a bit less toward plastic. Simpler, more direct, and immediately easier to tolerate. There's even a chorus here that could have worked. The kind of chorus that, with different production, might have been genuinely singable in a sweaty club. You can hear the potential, you really can, but once again, the production gets in the way. Everything is sealed off. The music gets no air, no breathing space, no dynamics. Where a good punk track should push and pulse, this feels vacuum-packed, layer upon layer upon layer, without adding anything of value. The result is a song that should have been simple and effective, but instead sounds unnecessarily crowded and unfocused. The bridge makes it even stranger, as if the song briefly takes a wrong turn and never fully finds its way back. And once again, the vocals sit half buried in the mix, leaving the lyrics struggling to come through, which may be the most frustrating thing about Dirty Punk. This could have been a solid Clash track. Not brilliant, but solid, raw, singable. Instead, what you mostly hear is what it could have been. We're the Clash may be the most ironic moment on the entire album. A song that is meant to confirm, quite literally, that this band is still The Clash. And to be fair, the opening offers a brief moment of hope. The guitar riff sounds familiar, classic Clash territory, raw, angular, direct. But the moment the rest of the band comes in, something starts to feel off. The drums and guitars sound like they belong to two different songs. They move alongside each other rather than pushing together. What should feel powerful instead feels oddly loose and uncoordinated. Strummer sings with bite and conviction, but the overall effect feels less like a focused punk band and more like a slightly drunken pub group struggling through a rehearsal. And that's painful, because this song is clearly meant as a statement. A declaration, we are still The Clash. Yet that statement never convinces. There are still elements here that almost work. The funky guitar and percussion hint at a groove that could have carried the track. But once again, everything is smothered by production choices and a chorus that feels more chaotic than powerful. And just like the previous tracks, the lyrics are largely swallowed by the mix, making the message, which should be central here, difficult to grasp. Perhaps the most bittersweet aspect is this. The Clash once sounded far better than this. And because of that, We Are the Clash feels less like a triumphant declaration and more like an attempt to convince yourself that it's still true. By the time we reach Are You Ready?, we are firmly in overproduction territory. The arrangement screams 1980s, but in all the wrong ways, not exciting or innovative, just misplaced. As if this song belongs to an entirely different musical universe than that of The Clash. The vocals, once again, barely intelligible, and by now, that's becoming a pattern. Strummer sits somewhere deep in the mix, fighting to rise above a wall of synths and percussion, and losing that battle almost every time. The synth loops are perhaps the most distracting element here. They sound cheap, almost comical, while the lyrics are probably trying to say something serious. Probably, because it's difficult to tell. The words disappear beneath the arrangement yet again. And that's frustrating, because underneath all those layers, there's actually a fairly catchy song here. A simple structure, a chorus that could have stuck. With a more restrained approach, this might have been a decent album track. Instead, this may be the song that suffers most from the production so far. Everything is full. Everything is crowded. Nothing has space. The track runs just under 3 minutes. But by the time it ends, it feels like you've already listened to half an album. We're not even halfway through.
When does the hurting stop?
Oh, no, hold on a minute.
No, Peter. It doesn't get any better. The riff of Cool Under Heat immediately sounds familiar. A little reminiscent of Should I Stay or Should I Go? Direct, simple, effective. On paper, exactly the kind of foundation The Clash always excelled at. And honestly, in terms of structure, this may be one of the stronger songs on the album so far. There's a clear framework. A chorus that could have worked. A track that, with a different approach, might have been genuinely convincing. But once again, the production gets in the way. The vocals sit far too low in the mix, a problem that affects almost the entire album. Strummer sounds as if he's standing somewhere in the back of the studio while the rest of the arrangement crowds the foreground. Then the chorus arrives, taken over by what sounds like a football terrace choir. Massive, loud, and almost completely unintelligible. The words disappear into the collective shouting. The verses are slightly less congested than on earlier tracks, but there's still far too much happening that adds nothing. Extra layers, extra sounds, extra noise. With no clear purpose, everything blends into one dense mass. And that may be the least Clash-like aspect of this album. The Clash were always about directness, urgency, songs that hit like a punch. Here, every 3-minute track feels like 3 minutes too long. Not necessarily because the material itself is weak, but because it's suffocated by choices that never allow the songs to breathe. Under different production, Cool Under Heat might genuinely have worked. Instead, what lingers most is the sense of missed potential. And then, movers and shakers. For the first time on this album, you briefly think, okay, this actually sounds a little like The Clash. The drums are staccato, so is the guitar riff. There's even a plucked bass line underneath that builds a bit of tension. For a moment, you catch a glimpse of what this could have been, and then, there they are again. The synths. As if someone, mid-rehearsal, suddenly pressed a button labeled Fake Mexican Trumpet. The sound drops into the chorus seemingly at random, disappears again, and leaves mostly confusion behind. And of course, the football terrace choir returns. Massive, overstated, unnecessary. Where the interplay between Mick Jones and Joe Strummer once carried more impact than 24 overdubs ever could, everything here is smothered in layers that mostly get in the way. And that's unfortunate, because the chorus itself isn't actually that bad. There's something catchy in there, a core idea that could have worked. But the overall sound, muddy, overproduced, synthetic, makes you reluctant to hear the song again. And that may be the greatest sin of movers and shakers. There's a Clash-like skeleton underneath, but it's completely drowned out by misguided choices. And then, suddenly, this is England. For the first time on this album, something unexpected happens. Space. The tempo slows down. The rhythm leans gently toward reggae. And as a result, the entire track immediately feels calmer, more balanced. The electronic drums are still difficult to ignore. They remain somewhat artificial, and they do drain a bit of warmth from the sound. But for the first time on this record, you actually hear a song. The chorus is intelligible. The message comes through. Strummer sounds more at home here, as if he's finally been given room to breathe. And that makes a significant difference. Beneath the production, which is still far from ideal, there is simply a good song here. In fact, this is without question the most listenable moment on the album so far. That says something about This Is England. But it also says something about everything that came before it. There's a clear direction to this track, a calmer, more considered structure. And for the first time, something on this album actually feels worthy of the clash. Even the large, communal chorus, which sounded misplaced on earlier tracks, finally works here, because it supports the emotion of the song instead of suffocating it. After a long sequence of overcrowded, chaotic tracks, This Is England feels almost like relief, as if briefly you're hearing what this album might have been. Wait, is this actually a good song?
Well, no, hold on a minute.
No, we're not there yet. The relief of This Is England doesn't last long. With Three-Card Trick, we're quickly back in familiar territory. The electronic percussion immediately gives the track a slightly clownish quality. Everything sounds just a little too plastic, too cheerful, too forced. And yet, this isn't a disaster. In fact, it's actually quite catchy, easy enough to follow, reasonably listenable. After everything we've heard so far, that alone almost feels like progress. The tone may be slightly too upbeat for a band like The Clash. It lacks the sharpness and urgency you would normally expect. But because it feels less suffocated than many of the earlier tracks, you notice something interesting as a listener. You start settling for less. The bar has simply been lowered. Under different production, and especially with real drums, this song would have carried more weight and credibility. As it stands, it lingers somewhere between serious and playful, never fully committing to either. Still, in fairness, it's nowhere near as bad as much of what came before, and at this stage of the album, that alone feels like a small victory. But we shouldn't congratulate ourselves too soon. We're not done yet. Play to Win opens as if you've accidentally switched on an Atari console. Sound effects, disembodied voices, fragments without context. It feels less like a song and more like a sound check. The percussion, however, has something going for it. There's a pleasant, almost Latin-leaning groove underneath that works reasonably well. And when the track finally begins, or what passes for its beginning, you can hear that, at its core, there's something usable here. The vocal parts aren't bad. The bass is solid. The guitars are used sparingly but effectively. All the ingredients for a decent song are present. Only, the track is constantly interrupted by collages of voices and sound effects. Interludes that lead nowhere and repeatedly pull you out of whatever flow the song is trying to establish. Verse, chorus, transition, it never becomes entirely clear. And that's a shame, a real shame, because beneath all the experimental clutter sits a chorus strong enough to anchor a solid Clash song. Remove the unnecessary fragments and replace them with actual structure. And this could easily have been convincing. Instead, Play to Win feels like an unfinished idea, a sketch that was never completed. As if halfway through, someone decided that adding more voices and effects was more important than finishing the song itself. The wrong turn was taken early, and no one ever returned to the main road. With Finger Poppin', the tempo seems to pick up again, or at least it feels that way. Though with these electronic drums, it's sometimes hard to tell whether the track is actually faster or simply gives that impression. The slapping bass line initially keeps things afloat. As long as you focus on that, the song remains just about tolerable. There's a groove here that suggests it might lead somewhere, but then the chorus arrives, and it collapses almost immediately. No clear hook, no melody that lingers. Instead, a half-spoken, half-sung passage that drains all the momentum built up in the verses. What remains is a track that constantly feels in motion, yet never truly arrives anywhere. The crowded arrangement doesn't help. Everything is moving, everything demands attention, but nothing is given the space to make a real impact. It feels like an attempt to echo talking heads during their fear of music or remain in light period, but without the subtlety, without the vision, and without the songs. And so Finger Poppin' becomes another missed opportunity, a track where you occasionally hear fragments of something interesting, but where the overall focus is completely absent. By this stage of the album, something else also becomes clear. This no longer sounds like a band working toward a shared goal. It sounds like a project where the creative struggle has already been lost, and Joe Strummer seems present but no longer truly in control. North and South actually begins quite well. There is, as much as this album allows, a sense of space, a melody that seems to be heading somewhere, a mood that could almost be described as restrained. For a brief moment, you think, perhaps there's still a late highlight to come, but before long, the arrangement begins to interfere again. Additional layers, extra sounds, mixing choices that once more push the vocals into the background. What could have been a genuinely sensitive moment becomes overcrowded and unsettled. And that may well be the central thread running through this entire album. North and South could have been a stronger song, with a more restrained arrangement, with production that supports emotion instead of suffocating it, with enough space for Strummer's lyrics to truly land. In another world, this might have been a genuinely moving Clash track, the kind of song that even longtime fans would have praised for its vulnerability. Their version of Angie, in a sense. But on Cut the Crap, it settles at roughly 75%. And that missing 25% is precisely the difference between a good song and a missed opportunity. We're now approaching the end of the album, and one conclusion begins to take shape. The songs here are either genuinely weak, or they remain trapped in what might have been. We've reached the final stop. Life is wild. Perhaps there's still a positive surprise waiting at the end of this record.
Well, no, hold on a minute.
No, Peter. It's over. The track opens with someone asking for a cigarette. And honestly, that feels appropriate. Not out of coolness, but out of mild exhaustion. And then the final song of Cut the Crap begins. The first thought, have my ears simply adjusted to this production by now? Or were the earlier tracks genuinely worse than what we've heard on the second half? Probably a combination of both, because Life is Wild is decent. Nothing more, nothing less. There's a foundation that works, a song structure that is at least recognizable. At this stage of the album, that almost feels like a luxury, but as soon as the chorus arrives, things go wrong again. The mass stadium choir returns, even thicker than before, layered with additional sound effects and voices. As if the song wasn't already crowded enough, what remains is a track that might have been perfectly solid on paper, but is once again suffocated by excessive production choices. And that may be the most accurate summary of the album as a whole. Life is Wild isn't a disaster, but it's also not a song you feel compelled to revisit. And ultimately, the same can be said for the album itself. After one complete listen, you understand the idea. And honestly, that is probably enough. So, the question we started with, The Clash. Cut the Crap. Is it really that bad? The short answer, yes. The long answer, also yes. But that doesn't mean this episode had no value. Quite the opposite, because beneath this avalanche of synths, drum machines, and questionable production choices, there are, in fact, songs hidden here and there, fragments of ideas, moments where you briefly hear what this album might have been. But those moments are almost always drowned out by production that smothers everything in its path. This is not a hidden masterpiece, not a misunderstood gem, but it's not entirely worthless either. It is, above all, a document of a band in transition, a band in conflict, perhaps even a band that was already over before the recording began. And yet, even on an album with a reputation like this, there is always something to uncover, if only to understand how things went wrong. And that remains the core of this series, to revisit poorly received albums and decide for ourselves what, if anything, still remains. What I can say is this: I listened to this album in full, from beginning to end. Voluntarily. No one asked me to. There was no emergency, no obligation, no compelling reason, except for the music. So yes, this was a sacrifice, a small musical sacrifice, for the archive, for the record, for humanity, so that you don't necessarily have to. Cut the Crap might have been better off cutting the word cut from its title, because yes, this album is in many ways exactly what the title suggests: crap. In compilations and box sets that claim to contain the complete recordings of The Clash, this album is often quietly absent. Even the band themselves distance from it after its release, and have rarely defended the final product. That was a heavy one. I barely made it through. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to spend some quiet time with London Calling. And that was The Clash. And that was Cut the Crap. What do you think of this album? Is it really the misfire its reputation suggests? Or are you perhaps a defender of this record? Let me know in the comments below. I'm always curious to hear your perspective. You can listen to This Is England by The Clash in the Spotify playlist, alongside all the other music featured in this series, the more listenable selections included. You can also follow the channel on Facebook and Instagram for updates, because I will follow you if you follow me. And if you'd like to support the channel, consider liking the video, subscribing, and enabling notifications so you never miss an episode. Thank you for watching. See you next time. And in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.